So one small update. I uploaded to the Google Drive folder, the original one. There was the link. I uploaded a small, very small script. It's called Stylometry script.r. Because I realized that we don't have the stable kind of commands that you can easily copy or easily run. So I just made there's 3 lines basically: install packages, load library, and execute the basic stylo function. So I will just quickly go with you now before I go get it back to Joanna. Quickly go with you through basic RStudio stuff. No R, it's just I show you how the interface works and stuff like that. And also show you how to set up the directory as well, the easiest way to set up the directory. So let me share my screen and desktop. Yeah, great. So let's say that this is the desktop. That's my desktop, and you have here the folder that you downloaded, right? Of the Google Drive folder. So you open this folder. There are some files, some folders as well. Folders within folders. There's folder corpus, which would be kind of important later. And if you have the new script, you can also put it here. The stylo minimal script. The easiest way to set your working directory so that Stylo would recognize your folder and it would know where to look for texts is to open the script, the R script, with RStudio, right? Either open with or some other way you do that. So when you open the RStudio, it will look something like that, right? You will have the script open to you and holding all of the code there. And on the bottom here, you will have the console, the R, where the R runs and shows you the output, right? So the script will always stay the same on the top. This is like a notebook. Basically, you were exposed to the notebooks, right? You will have the code sitting there. You can change it. You can tackle it, and you can execute it, right? So one way to yeah. Sorry. Okay. So when you do it like that, when you open the script from the folder, right? You should have your working directory also set to this exact folder. So to check this, you can type set W, and Joanna will show it as well later. Not set, but get, sorry. Get WD, which stands for get working directory. And it should show you something like that. In my case, it's coming from the desktop, right? On the desktop, there's a folder, CLS Madrid Stylo. So to execute those things, how does it work, right? So you can either type directly into all your commands that you want in the console, right? But they would be, sorry, that's not a right statement. They would execute, but they won't stay in your notebook. They're just you're executing them directly in the console. To make things stay for you, you can do it in the script. You can type the same command in the script. You see it's here, but it's not executed yet. It's just there. Yeah. It's okay. Did you open the script from so first of all, yeah, you close all your RStudio that is there. If you have anything open, you close everything, you go to the folder, and you open the Google Drive folder that we're using. I had an update there, so there should be a new file, stylo minimal script. Yeah, sorry, that was the first announcement. Yeah. Sorry. Very recently. Yeah. You can just download the script itself and place it into the same folder. It's called Stylo Minimal Script. So let me drive. I just didn't thought about it before. You don't need to download the whole folder. You can just download. So here it is. Right? It's not necessary at all because you have all these commands in some slides. It's just like holds all these commands like in one file. I thought it would be easier. This is the top directory. So this is where the folders corpus and other things sit. So I see you already like copying it, but basically what you want is select it and download. And then put it in the folder that you already downloaded, the original folder, CLS Madrid, and open it from there. So it does have the package downloaded and installed, but yes, you need to kind of reload it into the memory. So the function library stylo, yeah, you need to do library stylo again. Yes. You unzip it.
Yeah, like the cubes, throwable cubes. We should buy that.
So when you download the folder, right, it's probably something you will see something like that. It's like a zip, it's an archive, so you need to extract it. Right, and you get the folder, the same folder locally that you have on the Google Drive. There's some interesting new things appeared in our Google Drive. It's okay. It's okay. It's fine.
Says the dog on fire.
Yeah. I just trimmed them a little bit because this is a shared folder, and I think I forgot to not give you the edit rights. So you can also do whatever you want.
Things.
You can do whatever you want in that folder. Be nasty.
Please don't be. We are nice people.
So NLP for Humanist Master is definitely not mine.
And after downloading to the new file to the folder in my computer, I open it with RStudio.
Yeah. So in my case, it's desktop again. So it was a desktop. I have the CLS Madrid folder from Google Drive. I open it, right? And there are some things here like corpus folder, NLP for Humanist Master. This is the GitHub. It's not, it's somebody's, some intrusion happened here.
It's already fixed.
Okay, thank you.
None of you have edit rights anymore.
But the link stay the same? So
the link stays the same.
Okay, good.
And also I don't have the edit rights now.
It's okay.
But you'll fix that.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is the folder, right? Where with the same folder that is in Google Drive, and you need to have the Stylo Minimal script here. It's just the easiest way to set up. So your working directory in R would be similar to where the corpus folder is. And the corpus folder is the mecca for Stylo. By default, the Stylo goes to corpus folder. So if you want, for example, to change something in the corpus, you can go to the corpus folder. You can put your own files there and do things like that. There's also, for those who are like advanced, and this is like super easy for you, in like Stylo Basics script, I show like different tricks of how to like set directory, for example, manually, and you can say that Stylo to look for corpus in another folder, but this is like not that we are concerned right now.
So
Yes.
just to be sure, we are supposed to use the corpus provided in the folder and not ours.
You're free to use yours as well.
Okay.
But we will demonstrate the Stylo interface and things like that using our small collection of English fiction. Yeah.
So the type of text that you have provided in the corpus
Yeah.
is different with the type of text, for example, that I just want to double check, how do I create something similar? Because
Yeah.
for example, when it comes to tweets, how do I do that? Like,
Well, tweets, a good question. Basically, they're very small, right? There are two ways, to do that. Well, there are more ways, but in classic stylometry that counts words, it's super data hungry. So it needs like quite enough texts. Few 1,000 words is like a perfect, I think, cutoff. So you can, for example, if you have like some categories of tweets, like coming from this group of people and this group of people, you assemble into one TXT file. Right, and then you maybe compare them, but putting the tweets in a single TXT file, single tweets in a single TXT file was probably like a bad idea, because basically you won't catch anything except like few most frequent words.
Okay, so just to double check what so if I just, let's say I have an Excel sheet, can I convert that Excel sheet to TXT? Automatically, will I have to copy pasting to a TXT or something like that?
Good question. Yes, you can convert it to TXT with like some Python scripts to go to over each row and then copy it. But Excel sheets or you can also use the so-called comma separated value format.
Yeah,
It's like a plain table. It will return each row as a very simply encoded line.
Okay.
And you will have the text there. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
But there are a lot of like pre-processing issues. So one thing that I forgot to tell you, or maybe I should, before, is that Stylo is not a pre-processing software, right? So it does not handle pre-processing for you. It has like a little bit of actually a lot of assumptions that it does for you, especially when it comes to text, the tokenizing. So cutting things into words. There are many ways to do that. So of course, Stylo tries to make minimal choices for you, but there are still a lot of them, right? So whenever you prepare text for Stylo, you want to prepare it outside, right? Either using some Python scripts or some other tools that you are comfortable with. But pre-processing, getting data in the format that you want is probably one of the biggest kind of challenges that you need to overcome when you start to do like computational studies. Yes.
Can I ask a couple of questions?
Yes.
Can you say something about the minimum word count required or desired for files, and also whether you should be comparing texts of similar length, or what happens if you're comparing very short novellas with very long novels?
Good question.
We will be talking about this.
We will be talking about this a bit later. This is basically Justin just asked like the whole like field does the whole field does think about the length and their relationship with the analysis. But it's a very important, the length is a very important question here. Yeah.
Just teasing,
Yeah. So anyways, are we on the same page more or less? So the folder, there should be a script, the Stylo minimal script. And if you open it, sorry, I closed my studio. Before you open it, you need all our associated things closed. So closed everything and then reopen it from the folder. So if you open with the script, you're opening with our studio, and our studio would load. And you should see the script. And as I said before, if you do the get WD, you should see the path. This is the path, right, to your folder, to the working directory that R currently uses. And it now knows basically all the files that are sitting in this folder. This is the easiest way. Joanna will talk about other things, other ways to do resetting your working directory. For example, if you have like corpus somewhere on other side of the globe, on the other side of your hard drive, right? There are still ways to access it, of course, but this is what I call the path situation. Whenever we talk about like files and allocations and like organization, this becomes tricky for for people who didn't have exposure to that, because nowadays we don't think of the operating systems in terms of paths, right? And files that are hierarchically organized somewhere. We think about the apps mostly. It's okay. It's okay to be confused about these things. So how does the Zoom chat doing? Hi Zoom chat, by the way.
On how to run particular things in the script. If you need
Okay.
to
Yeah.
hit enter every time, or you can do run for the whole thing.
So this is the next thing that I wanted to show you. So for example, there are a few ways to run, because this is now script is sitting, but it's not running, not executing, right? So one thing is you can just select the lines that you want to execute, and you probably can't see it very well on the screen, but there is like a green button on top of the layout, on top of the script layout, that says run, right? You can click that, and you'll see that in the console it immediately reacts to that, right? So it loads the stylo version 0.74. There's also other ways to do shortcuts to this. You can whenever your like mouse pointer sits, you can just type Control Enter, not type, but like press Control and Enter. I think for Mac users it would be Command and Enter, maybe. Yeah. Okay. Good. And it will also execute it quickly for you, right? So these are basically the only things we will need to know. If you're curious about R, so R is very similar in many ways, similar in our organization to Python, also high-level language. However, it has developed, evolved from people in bioinformatics and statistics. So this is the biggest communities that are behind the development of our language. So it mostly was designed for very specific tasks. Then it grew into popularity and started to become more general purpose language. But it has its own heritage of being like the nerd language. In a way. So since you were exposed already to a Python, we don't have like any, any wish to confuse you even more with some new amazing X+1 commands in R. So we just use R for like basic style operations. However, again, if you're curious, there is the stylo basic script, both in the form of Jupyter Notebook or like Colab Notebook, and both in the form of RMD, R Markdown document. You can, if you're curious, you can load it and look at the different things there as well. So any questions? Are we all here on this screen? Great. That actually went better than I expected.
Yeah, you guys are doing great. And this is not like, fake stuff to make you feel good. It is good. Like, we're used to half a day of fixing installation issues and so on. So kudos to you.
So that's where I get the word to Joanna. And if you have like any questions, I can be around, and I'll also monitor the Zoom chat. So let me stop sharing the screen.
Yeah, I will tell you a few more things, and then we will jump into doing things, and especially in the doing things phase. Whenever you have issues, please just raise your hand up so that we can address them immediately. It's much easier if you immediately address it. Then we don't want to lose you and find you again 2 hours later in a completely solemn, depressing place. Is my mic off? Yes. Okay, so just making sure you hear me well, right? And I hope you will be able to see things well as well. Yes. Good. So this session now will be about introductions to Stylo and making Stylo work for you with the basic functions. And as already said, all of the installation issues and so on are described on the GitHub. Also, there is lots of materials on the website. There are links everywhere in our slides, so feel free to take a look. Also, as you go home and you want to do more, hopefully this will come in useful. And as Artyom already told you about John Barrows and about some findings of his. He noticed that in most discussions about in literary studies, in this case about English fiction, but you can think here Italian fiction, Spanish fiction, Indian fiction, basically any kind of fiction or written work that you can imagine. We proceed as if a third or 2/5 or even half of all our material or our words were not really there. If you come from literary studies, you're used to the fact that we focus on the words that mean something, on the words that carry important information, that describe what the text is about, that we analyze the adjectives that the author is using and so on. But actually in stylometry, we focus on those non-important words. As Barrows further described, these words are, for English, usually 8 personal pronouns, 6 auxiliary verb forms, 5 prepositions, 3 conjunctions, 2 adverbs, the definite and indefinite articles, and 4 other words such as to, that, for, and all. And those are grammatical words that don't really carry much meaning, but they serve a very important grammatical function in our texts, and they almost always find their place in the first 30 most common words of the whole text. And this is something that's sometimes hard for us to believe, that you can actually extract that much about the style from just these words that seem very unimportant. But the thing is that we use them unconsciously. We don't actively think about how we connect words in the sentence. We're thinking about what we want to say. We're thinking about how to say it when we can form a nice communicate and use the words that will be more understandable or perhaps that will be more elegant and so on. But we don't think about how we are connecting, which forms we're using and so on. And as surprising as it is, in fact, in however many languages we look at, there will be this group of words that will always be appearing very high on our frequency list and becoming important. So today we will be experimenting with a small collection of British fiction that you have probably already downloaded. And just to also touch down and make sure you all get this and feel it intuitively. Artyom was telling you about the absolute and relative frequencies of particular words. And these are the actual values copied from the beginning of our corpus. We have a couple of female and male authors in this corpus, and this is just a selection of a few books by Sisters Bronte and by Jane Austen, and the distribution of most frequent words in them. And here you can see that these words are actually, as I told you, the words that don't really carry much meaning, except for, of course, we can make some hypothesis here about how the word I is used and whether the book is in the first or third person, and so on. But we can also see that there are quite big differences between particular books and also between particular words. And first of all, an intuitive question: why do we have that many D for Jane Eyre when we have so little of it for Agnes? Remember, these are absolute values, so the actual number of the words, how many times the word was used in the book. Exactly. This is a very intuitive, simple question. The book is shorter, so we have fewer values of particular kind. And this is why we never use absolute values in this kind of analysis, because it would immediately skew our analysis in the wrong way. We would think like, okay, so clearly Emily Bronte, when she was writing Jane Eyre, she was just using definitive articles so much more than other authors. That's not true. It's just that her book was longer. It's only when we look at the relative frequencies that we will see this difference. But still, we can observe some patterns for particular authors and so on. So once we translate it into relative frequencies, which basically means that we take these absolute values and compare them to the number of words in the whole novel, and we get the percentage. And again, Artyom already told you this, that a ridiculous percent of the book are the words that don't really mean much. Like in our case here, the word D makes up as much as 4% of Jane Eyre. So now we know that it's yes, it's a longer book, but it's also that Emily Bronte uses definitive articles a bit more often than her sisters. But then we can look at the very interesting word I. And here we can see that in some books we have over 3% of the word I, and in some others we have just like somewhere between 1.5% up to 2%. Again, an intuitive question. What do you think is the reason for that? Sorry? Exactly, yeah. Whether the book is the point of perspective, whether the book is written from the first person narrative or the third person narrative. And now you can also think about your corpus design, because today we will be using this corpus that we devised for you. But as you proceed, you will want to do your own experiments and build your own corpora, analyze the things you are interested in, and not necessarily just a small collection of British fiction. And this is one of the things to consider. When you mix books in the first person narrative with the third person narrative, the use of words such as I will become a quite important factor, because this word is already on the 5th position of the most common words in the whole corpus. So it will be one of the very important features, a feature that will distinguish whether the texts are considered similar or not. Of course, not just this feature, but it will be one of the influences. And now you can also visualize how we already mentioned that there are different things to consider when you're setting up your corpus. That, for example, it's not necessarily a good idea to have in your corpus books from the 16th century and from the 20th century and analyze them together. Why? Because the spelling differences will be quite striking, and a lot of these words will end up high on the frequency list, or they will actually be appearing in a couple of places, so that the signal of a particular word will be diluted because it will be written in 2 or 3 forms across the whole corpus. So rather than being, for example, 14th on the list, it will become 170th and 180th, and so on. So these are all things to consider, to have more or less the similar perspective, preferably, and the same time frame, so that you don't have the mixed spelling. The same also goes with variants of language. I heard that in the end of last session, we had a question in the chat about how to analyze different languages. Well, the sad thing is that you cannot really throw into your corpus texts in English, German, Spanish, and Latin and expect that they will be analyzed together, because this is a method that relies solely on the most frequent words or most frequent character chunks. So the influence of the language here will be very important. So even analyzing books written in American spelling and British spelling can already cause you some problems, because you will have the same word written a couple of times in different ways, and this will influence the position of the word. So unfortunately, in this kind of settings, if you want to compare the situation in different languages, the best thing would be to have separate corpora for separate languages and then compare the situation. And this is actually something that we do in translation studies, which is my background. We usually have collections of translations in different languages, and this is a very interesting perspective, because if we look at the same book and how it behaves in different translation circles, for example, how a given book behaves, let's think about, for example, Lord of the Rings. It's a classic book. Most of us have read it, I would imagine. And this is a book, the same with The Hobbit, that was translated into many, many languages. And this is also the book that's behaving completely differently in various languages. I tried reading it in German and Spanish that I speak a little bit, and I could sense that there is something off, but looking at it stylometrically would show you that actually the German version might be a bit more serious and a bit more closer to the historical literature, whereas the Spanish version would be more humorous and closer to children's books, for example, talking about The Hobbit still. So the translation will also influence this, but you can see that different novels will behave differently and different languages will behave differently. So this is always something to consider when you set up your data set. Questions at this point? Mm-hmm.
So you were talking about the difference of different spelling between American and British. So let's say that I want to count the number of repetition or frequency of September, the word September. And some people, specifically in my area, would not say September as full, but they use Sep or whatever. So does that mean, again, I have to create different sort of corpus for that, because, or would that automatically capture SIP for September?
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. No, it won't be caught automatically. So you would need to address this manually. There are two approaches about this. One is that sometimes we have consistent errors that, for example, there are two spellings of one word and we choose to ignore it because we want to see what's the proportion of particular spellings. And another approach would be if you're interested, for example, that you just want to know, you're not interested in how many times each form appeared. You just want to build a Fourier profile. Then the simplest way would be to fix it one way or the other. So just manually change it. And in this way, you would be sure about this. So maybe one important thing also to clear, once we will run Stylo in a second and you will see it yourselves, but there is this important concept of word. When we're thinking about language and we're thinking about words, in European languages, it's relatively simple. Like we have clear separation between words. The words are not really merging together, so they are separately, and it's very easy to distinguish between them. So Stylo reads the words just as a chunk of letters or other characters that will be delimited by space. This will be what will actually create a break. But if you think about languages such as Japanese, for example, which is an agglutinative language, which means that you add things to the end of the words to make sense, and you also have the whole character that represents a word rather than a chunk of characters, then you have to think about it differently. It's not necessarily that the space will be the best delimitation of words. So these are things to consider. This is also why you can use words, but you can also use chunks of characters. So you can, for example, ask your Stylo to just analyze chunks of two characters together, and then it will give you, for example, let me look at the example here, TH, HE, AN, ND, and so on. So you will have all of these uses, and this will be used to create the stylistic profiles of particular texts or of particular authors. And in many cases, this can be more useful. Perhaps you are also interested in discourse analysis, and you don't care that much about particular words, but you want to see how particular phrases are used in the sentences and so on. And you can also use this do that by just choosing to use combinations of words, the so-called n-grams. N-grams is also a concept from quantitative linguistics of connecting two or three or more parts, n number of parts. And in Stylometry, we don't really use chunks of chunks of words that much, so n-grams of words. If you want to use diagrams of words or trigrams of words, this will be very useful for discourse analysis. And then you can catch interesting phrases. For example, for me, it was very useful in my television studies when I analyzed the character dialogues and the language specific to particular characters, whether they were more inclined to use I phrases or ask questions, and this would tell me something about their position in the show and how they are to be considered, whether they are more active or more supporting and so on. So you can do this kind of things, but for authorship, chunks, so n-grams of characters will be more useful than n-grams of words.
Yeah, thank you. I think I have some kind of a follow-up question to that.
Mm-hmm.
Because you said before that using text from different centuries might not be a good idea because I don't quote you correctly probably, that they are too different or that they have too many factors that differ. So I would like to know if, on the other hand, are there texts that are too similar to compare with Stylo, like texts that are just from different editions of books or translations? And in those cases, is it not even useful to have like this kind of differences between abbreviations and full words and different like typography or stuff. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. And yes, you can absolutely do this. I would say it depends also on the question that you want to ask, because if your research question is that you want to see how much variation there is in 5 different translations of Shakespeare into Spanish, let's say, then you absolutely can use this like this, because you were just comparing what's making these translations different and which of them are more similar to one another. The thing is that if you're, for example, interested in profiling comedy versus tragedy, like Artjom was showing the example that how to examine drama, comedy versus tragedy. If you take comedic texts from 16th century and from contemporary times, they will be very different. They will be different in the form because the conventions change. There will be different conventions depending on the country. And for example, a couple of years ago, I had this study with my colleague Laura Hernandez Lorenzo. She was also here a while ago, and we were examining differences. We wanted to examine the authorship of a particular New Mexico play published in the 17th century that was written for the Spanish king. When New Mexico was a Spanish province, it was, the effect of colonization and so on. And there were different authors that we suspected of being the author, and especially the first female Mexican author, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, an amazing person. I highly recommend getting to know her. She's an amazing writer. And to examine her against other writers at the time, we collected texts from the 17th century, which was the time that the text was created. But it was very difficult to balance, for example, for the gender, and also very difficult to balance for the place of origin, because we knew that the play, the anonymous play in question was written in New Mexico, but we didn't in Mexico, not New Mexico, New Spain, the so-called. But we didn't have that many plays that were also written there. We had a lot of plays that were written in Spain. So we had to take this into account, that we cannot have our model skewed too much to consider everything, that it has to be exactly as the king would approve here in his kind of Spanish. Because otherwise our model would be recognizing it incorrectly. Yeah, I'm drifting a bit away from your question, but yeah, in this kind of situations, you can use texts that are similar, and these small differences will give you a lot of information. But if we threw too many texts from one or another region to our corpus, then our results would be skewed. Once we started using the 17th century versions, the digitized versions, we had to transcribe a couple of plays more from the editions from the 17th century, because if we use the modern digitized versions, there would be a different spelling of some words, and this would already be problematic because the words would be misrecognized. And since our authorial signal was very weak there, we had to take every precaution to make sure that we're not committing fraud, basically, but we're actually examining something in a solid, reliable way. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I first want to thank you for acknowledging the existence of non-European languages and the problems that people who might be working with non-Latin script languages are facing. Sometimes I find it frustrating that the conversation in these committees tend to be very Eurocentric, left to right, Latin script centric. So I really appreciate that you take your time to, for example, give the example of Japanese and what might be potential solutions for people who might be working with non-European, non-Latin script languages. My research language is Ottoman Turkish, which is written in Arabic script, and it is both agglutinative and inflected language, which means it is very difficult to lemmatize and identify the stems of the words to even perform basic word count or create a word cloud. And it sounds like n-grams might be a solution to my problem.
Yeah.
And I guess we are probably not going to have enough time to go into details of learning how to use n-grams for these kind of cases. I just wanted to ask if you could recommend sources, tutorials, sample studies who might be utilizing n-grams for, especially for non-Latin script or non-European languages.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. We will touch a bit upon n-grams because it's not that much different from the words. And yeah, thank you for working on Turkish because there are very few studies working on stylometry in Turkish. I remember there's one colleague in Hungary who's working on that, and both of us were working on Persian a while ago. And Jacek, who is sitting there in the red shirt, is actually working on Hindi. So there might be some, general knowledge here. Let's chat more, and absolutely we can post some materials as well. In general, working with other languages than English is not necessarily difficult in Stylo. Stylo has UTF-8 encoding implemented, so as long as your texts are saved in UTF-8, you should be safe, and your characters should be properly recognized. But whether to use words or n-grams and so on, it's always a question of choices. I would say experiment with the number of characters in n-grams and see how good the results get, especially using the data set that you already know what should be connected together. But yeah, let's chat more about this. And when it comes to lemmatization, we will also touch upon this a bit, because in stylometry, it not always makes sense to lemmatize. Many natural language processing applications require lemmatization. Like, for example, word embeddings definitely work better with lemmatized text, but in stylometry, not necessarily, because what we're interested in are still the most frequent words, which inflection doesn't necessarily catch them still. Even if we lemmatize, the difference is there is some gain of lemmatizing, but it's not very significant. And there are studies on this every now and then, and it's like, yeah, you increase your results by 4%. So this doesn't really make sense if your results are already over 80%, for example. But yeah, let's chat more about this in a while. Just a quick note, there is some action in chat, so I would suggest you look also at the Zoom chat that they were asking, and some people sharing about their experiences. There's also a question to you, Joanna. Can I read it? Yeah, of course. Thank you. From Katrin. So you told you analyze audio transcripts. What do I have to consider if, for example, I want to compare the transcript of Ring of Power by Amazon Prime with Rings of Power in the Silmarillion by Tolkien? Is this possible at all because of the different forms of the text speeches in the series versus the narration in the book? Oh yeah, that's an excellent question. I wish I had a simple answer to this. It's not so straightforward because language of television is much different from the language of fiction. There is much less narration, of course, and the dialogue is much higher. So there is not really a direct way to compare it. I would maybe look at particular phrases and see like how much overlap would there be, like whether Rings of Power is actually using a lot of dialogue from Tolkien. But from what I remember from Silmarillion, there isn't much dialogue in Silmarillion, so this might be very difficult. But yeah, this would be a very experimental question. If you start doing this, I'll be very happy to take a look at your results. So feel free to consult me, and I'll be happy to discuss that in more detail. Yeah. Okay, shall we move further? Yeah. So we already discussed the relative frequencies, and Artyom already mentioned Barrow's delta and different ways of comparing the distances between novels. So what you end up with is usually some sort of numerical representation of the distance between two particular novels. In this case, as in most stylometric applications, you will see that 0 will mean that the texts are identical. The higher the value, the less similar particular texts are. But don't get too attached to this image because this is very difficult to read. So we usually don't want to read it this way. We want to have something more fun. But before we get to different types of images that you can get, let's make sure that we can click stuff, and I don't want you to fall asleep, so let's do some things. So who has managed to, you all have RStudio running, right? You managed to have Artjoms script running. So now there are different ways to set your directory. Setting your directory is important because you need to tell Stylo where to look for the files that it wants to examine. And with this set, there is another important thing to consider. Whenever you're doing a stylometric experiment, you need to have some sort of big folder where all of your things will be. Let's say, in my case, this is called a small collection of British fiction. You should also have the same if you downloaded the data. Yes? No, if your computer is strong, it's 5,000 books is not too much. It might be difficult to read the results. For example, cluster analysis will not be very good for reading, but you can absolutely use network analysis for that, and this will be excellent. So yeah, if you have a strong machine, it shouldn't have a problem. In general, the bigger your corpus, the more time consuming it will be to complete the calculations, but the sky is the limit when it comes to the size. The sky and your computational power, because you might kill your laptop. Well, not permanently, but like temporarily kill it. So once you have your folder, in our case, a small collection of British fiction, but it might be my favorite corpus or my beautiful data or whatever, you need to have another folder within it. And this folder needs to be called corpus, spelled with small c, like this. I hope you can see it because I cannot really increase the size of this. I think. Oh, no, I can. That's perfect. So yeah, so you want to have another folder called corpus, and within this folder, you should have text. So if you downloaded the data, you will see that this is the form that you have. 27 texts, they are all written in TXT, saved in TXT, and TXT is usually the best format to go because this is easy to calculate. It will be very, very fast compared to other formats. Plus, there is no external encoding that can influence what gets recognized as words or characters. If you're using HTML, Stylo reads HTML, but occasionally if the HTML is badly formatted, parts of code might be recognized as the actual content of the novel or other text that you're examining. So then you might not be overly happy with this. So good rule of thumb, always get your text in TXT, always save them in UTF-8, and then no problems should happen. Why do we need the corpus folder? This is because Stylo will be producing some outputs. It can give you pictures, it can give you tables and so on, and we don't want this mixed up with our texts. So our text, our data is always in the corpus folder, and this is where we don't touch it. Stylo reads them and does calculations, but whatever it outputs will be here in this main folder. I also have, and you should also have here, the primary and the secondary set, and we will need this after lunch for another experiment of comparing two groups of texts. But for now, let's just make sure that we're here. And as already mentioned as well, there are different ways to set your directory. If you're using R on Windows, you can just select menu and go to file and change directory and make sure that your directory is called a small collection of British fiction, so that you are in this big umbrella directory where you will have corpus, primary set, secondary set, and so on. But if you're using RStudio, you can also do this in menu, go to more and go to set as working directory. Sorry? How to do this? I will try. So I might have a different version. Sorry. Oh, Artyom, help me. Sorry.
I was answering the chat.
And of course. Where is the set working directory in RStudio now? Has it changed?
Sorry, in RStudio on the right pane, right? There is the small. You probably cannot see it, but there is a small, like what is it called? The wheel.
The wheel,
the
yeah.
wheel, yeah. Right. If you click the wheel, it will open some options on the right.
On the right. So if you have this panel, like maybe let me show it here. So you have this big screen, right? And you have the console where you put your comments. You have the environment where the pictures will be showing, and you have this part where there are various options to do. And here you can select more. It's the last one, at least in my computer, and set as working directory. But of course, to do this, first you need to find your directory here. Like make sure that the name here is, for example, a small collection of British fiction, as in my case, or my beautiful corpus, or something like this. And here you will see the whole path. So the whole direction, starting from your home directory, or yeah, nobody can hear me now, right? Sorry, I walked away from the microphone. What I meant to say is that it's also very useful that you can see the whole directory path from home up to the place where your corpus is located. And this will come in useful also for other things. Like I know some of you were struggling with path yesterday in Python, and here you have this whole direction clearly. There is also another way to set your working directory, and that is to say this explicitly, given the path. This is especially useful if you're using Linux, as I am, but there are it's not something that you have to do. And then the command is very easy. You just put set wd and the path in the brackets and in the quotation marks. So in this case, my path would be precisely that. Now I left it.
No favorite directory.
Yeah, now I don't have any favorite.
Just the quick remark, right?
But this will be good for actually showing this.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh,
Can I do
I'm
a
good.
remark?
Yeah, of course.
So if you did follow the previous, and so if you write the script from the folder where it is located without RStudio running previously, it will automatically set directory to the same folder, so you don't need to worry usually about working directories. But you know that the path to folders, path to documents, is probably the most complicated thing in programming ever. So if you're good with that, you will be good like with anything else.
Agreed.
Yes.
So why isn't yours in the
different for
corpus
Joanna.
folder?
No, it's like this. So the texts are located in the corpus folder, but because we will be producing images, tables, and so on, we want to point to a small collection of British fiction. So Stylo knows that it has to have the subfolder corpus within the folder that we are located in,
So there should
because
be,
it will automatically enter the corpus folder when doing the analysis.
so the corpus folder should be within your folder of text, not
Yes.
outside it. Okay.
Yeah. So you always point to the one folder up over the corpus. Did I understand?
Sorry, just again, quick remark. So Joanna is just not using the CLS Madrid Google Drive directory, right? Because you're
Oh,
using.
right. Sorry.
It's okay. Everything is fine. You don't need to do that. So basically it goes like that, right? So the Stylo is like working somewhere, right? It's running in some folder. It knows the reference folder, and in this folder should be a corpus folder.
Yeah.
Right, so it's like a one step down from the nested folder. So in our case, this is CLS Madrid Stylo. Right. In CLS Madrid Stylo, there sits the corpus folder.
Yes.
Right? This is exactly what we want. In this case, we want our working directory to be running at the top, so at the CLS Madrid Stylo.
Yes. Yes, that's true. Sorry, that's my error. I put my files on the CLS Madrid, right? But I forgot to download it after. Yes. Mm-hmm.
You don't use spaces because it won't work with spaces when you name the directories?
better not to use spaces. Like it might work, but it might also crash. In general, the same with names of the files. You will see that in our corpus, all of the files are named without the spaces. I know of many experiments that have spaces in names and they work, but occasionally things will crash. So this is like the way I would teach you to be safe. And actually another important thing here, the underscore here, the first underscore always distinguishes between the part that's treated as a class and the proper name. So in this case, we're looking for the author of particular text. So we have the author underscore the title, and this will make Stylo recognize the author or whatever happens before the underscore as the class that we are examining. So as the category that we are analyzing. So for example, if you wanted to see how the text from particular genres behave, the simple way to do this would be to just add comedy underscore and then the proper name and so on. Or the year would be give the year and then give the name of the author and title or whatever information you want to give. In general, anything that will be before the first underscore will be treated as the name of the category that we are examining. And you will see this in action in a second, because I know it can seem a little vague when we're just talking about it like this.
The file convention will be much clearer.
Yeah. So hopefully you have all managed to select your directories right now. If you have any problems, also let us know. And one simple way to examine this is to just go get WD. And get WD is a simple R command that will give you the working directory. Again, simple English, get working directory. And then you have the whole location. So if you're struggling in any way with finding out what's your path to the folder and so on, this is your path to the folder. This is exactly what this will be called. Of course, in your case, it will be Madrid CLS folder. So once we have this, we want to make sure that our library is loaded. If it gives you nothing after you've already loaded it before, don't worry about this. It only gives you the welcome message the first time you try to load it. You can try to load it like after every single action you take, but it will only give you the message once. Here it loaded correctly. There are no errors. We're good to go. And so let's try running Stylo. Everybody's on the same page here? Yeah? No? Yeah. But now it will also be a good test, because as we run Stylo, you will know whether everything is loaded properly or if it will break. And don't worry about it. It usually breaks the first time. So whatever errors are happening today, this is good. You want them to happen now with us, that we can help you, and not when you're at home alone and frustrated that it's not working. So okay, let's run Stylo. And now I'm really sorry, but there is no way to increase this, so you will have to be stuck with me and small fonts, but hopefully you see this window. Who has run Stylo and is not seeing the window? Please raise your hand. Okay, are you using RStudio? Okay. Okay, Artyom will help you. So, yeah, let's make sure that we're here. Yeah, it will appear in the separate window. So it might be that it just goes to a different window and you have to look for it. But once you see it, you will see that it has five main categories: input and language, features, statistics, sampling, and output. And these will all be important. And another important thing to remember is do not click OK until you're ready with all of the categories. OK will actually run the whole thing. Well, now as an experiment, because we're still waiting for some people to have everything set up, you can click OK, you have my permission. And just see if it works. If it breaks at OK, it means that we have some issues to address. But it should just do something like, ooh, I'm counting words. Maybe, yeah. It might be that it needs rights to save in your desktop or in your computer or something like this, because it's also something that often happens with installing libraries and so on, that it needs explicit permission for running things. So once you've written Stylo and you've hit OK, you should get a picture. Who has the picture? Please raise your hand. Yay, congrats. That's amazing. Who has errors? And yes, and also answering the question in the chat. I will just briefly take a look at this. Yes, so Stylo automatically expects that there is a corpus folder within the directory we're located in. And this is one of the most classic errors that you will get in general, that you forget to create a corpus folder and you try to run the analysis and it will say no corpus folder found. So always think about it, whether you have the corpus directory. There are ways to avoid having corpus directory, but we will not be getting into this. If you want to break Stylo, it will be your own responsibility. You can do this at home with the help of documentation. We strongly encourage this, but unfortunately cannot support you during the one-day workshop. I'm very happy that it seems to be working for a lot of you. Yeah, the X-Quartz error is described on the GitHub. This is also an answer to Zoom. And yeah, and the other questions perhaps later on. So anybody still having problems with getting the first picture? Please raise your hand. Okay, not in a separate window?
Again, I think I may be jumping over what it's planned, but one of the issues I've run into working with this is often the creation of the corpus, not just the design, but the ways in which you scrap the data. There are databases with texts, and how do you scrap it to create a corpus and so on. And I was wondering if it's part, like this kind of technical Python script to scrap databases was part of the things you had in mind, or that's like very specific and like individually oriented to be part of
That's
this?
very specific and individually oriented, because it will very much depend on the sources that you are using. So in various studies that I did, I used texts from different libraries, and sometimes it was possible to like collectively download. Sometimes it was not possible. Sometimes you need to do OCRs, which is another problem, because the text, especially the handwritten text, is very difficult to recognize for computers. Still, the solutions are getting better every year, but they are far from perfect. For example, if you're using news articles, and there is a whole section of stylometric studies also dedicated to examining tweets, for example, or news from particular media, then you need to have scrappers that will be specifically fit to the needs of particular websites. So you need to know the structure of the website. So there isn't really a straightforward way around this, I'm afraid. Like there are some simple commands that you can do, like in case of old websites, sometimes using wget, which is a Unix command, will be enough to download the whole website, for example. But very often you will just need to have a separate Python or R script that will use this, or just manually download the text, which of course depends on the size of your corpus. There are many online resources, like, for example, Project Gutenberg has a lot of books digitized, and they are already available in various formats, including EPUB, MOBI, but also TXT. So you can just download UTF-8 TXT, and then you know that your text will be basically ready for the analysis already. Because the thing is also, You can use pretty much any type of text you want, but if you have the text in PDF, this will be more problematic because first you need to do the conversions. Some characters might get misrecognized, even if it is a printed text. It is a well-known case in natural language processing that converting tables and columns into like plain text is a horrifying event and nobody likes it. So there are all these things to consider. Yeah. But if you're lucky, then maybe also somebody that you know has a data set available already that could be used for the analysis, because it's also quite common that there are many collections published. There are many collections on GitHub, and sometimes it's not even that you need to create a whole corpus from the start, but you can try to find the relevant corpora and even combine them, of course, citing the relevant sources, but basically relying on something that somebody else already built and tested and makes available for others. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And please cite corpora in general. If you're using ready-made corpora, please cite corpora, because people who make them make fantastic work for all of us, and their work is often unappreciated.
Okay. So to just get a sense of that, the process one more time, I downloaded the full folder in my laptop. So let's say in the future, I have my own corpus and my own data. These downloads should be always in my laptop, right? So the new text or whatever I'm adding is going to go to the Google Doc, and under corpus folder, I will put my own data. Would that automatically sync, or I have to download everything on my laptop in order to run the Stylo? How does that work?
You mean our Google Drive? You need to download it again because it's not synchronizing automatically on your computer.
Okay, so the process is that, yes. So the process is that I put my data in corpus folder, download the whole folder again to my laptop, and then go through R and then do everything, right? I think that section I'm not getting it well. How to do it if I add any data later on?
If you add the data later on, like make your own data, you don't have to put it on the Google Drive. The Google Drive is just us sharing our materials with you. So you just create a corpus folder on your computer, and a bigger folder that will be called like my first experiment or something like this, and it's all local. You don't have to download put it on the website on the Google Drive and so on.
Okay, I see. Okay,
I'm not sure if this was your question.
No, that's my question. But the corpus folder has to be created as what? Like
you just create a folder like like any other folder you would create on your computer.
Okay.
So you're using Windows, right?
Yes, I'm using Mac.
Sorry, Mac. So on Mac, you can just like create a new folder, right? Just by right-clicking and adding new folder. There are also commands to create new folders, but basically you create a new folder as if you were creating any other folder.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is just a name. There is nothing special about the properties of this particular folder. Okay. It's just the name.
Okay. And then when we go to R, then we'll choose that specific folder that we have on our laptop to run it.
Yeah. Okay. Like, for example, here you are using the CLS Madrid folder, but I am actually using the folder that is called, if you remember, a small collection of British fiction, simply because I already had it on my computer. And this is the name of my bigger corpus with experiment, but then within this, I have the corpus folder with the actual texts. But this folder could just as well be called my pretty experiment, my stupid experiment, I hate Stylo, and so on.
Is the underscore necessary for the Stylo to work?
No, but it's useful to have it because sometimes with different encodings and so on, things crash when there are no underscores. In general, the simplest way to make sure that everything works in usual with coding, you want to have underscores rather than spaces in the namings. And you also don't want to use special characters in the names of the files, because if you have a file that has no underscore and just the name, then the name will be considered the class. So it will be treated individually. And so maybe now this is a good point to look at the image. I hope that everybody has it.
I have just, sorry. I'm looking at the different results from the running, and I'm wondering if it is possible to configure some format as output, since here the default output are for a CSV file for the, just a minute. It's for the relation thing, I don't know. And then are two TXT file for table with frequencies and word list. So is it possible to configure this, how to put these results in different format as XML, JSON, or something else?
To some extent, yes, but not all. But we will cover this in a second when we talk about the particular settings. Okay. So I'll come back to this in a second, if that's okay. Mm-hmm.
Could I just very briefly, when we were talking about corpora,
Yeah.
mention the European Literary Text
Yes,
Collection?
thank you, Justin. Thank you.
Those of you who are interested in literature, which I assume will be the majority of you, this is a multilingual text collection of European fiction created between 1840 and 1920 across more than 20 European languages. And it's created by a predecessor project to CLS INFRA called Distant Reading for European Literary History. And it's a freely available, balanced corpus, and somebody might put a link to it in the
Why are we seeing the chat?
I don't know. It's your.
Why is it
yes,
showing
otherwise
this
known as
computer with
LTEC.
I don't know.
ELTEC.
Yeah. So if you just Google LTEC, this is actually the website, but there are repositories for separate languages in the GitHub. And actually, thank you, Justin, for reminding me, because I made a terrible error of forgetting that we did this. Yeah. But yeah, highly recommending it. It's also like if you're looking for text in specific languages, it's unfortunately just for European languages, but still this is quite a selection of text and a lot of great work of our colleagues. So now everybody got their first picture. Perfect. I'm very proud of you. There will be lunch break soon and you will be able to celebrate. But before we go there are just like a few things that we want to touch upon. So now that you have your first picture, we can take a look at them. If you're using you're getting it in a separate window. If you're using RStudio, you can just click on this zoom thing, and then it will also give you a separate window. And now you can see that you got this sort of a tree diagram. This is actually called cluster analysis or hierarchical clustering. And this is a tree structure. You might remember it from high school maths or even junior high school maths. Anyway, now you can see different texts positioned in various places with colors marking the author. This is why I said whatever is before the underscore can be useful, because now we have different colors corresponding to different authors, simply because our authors are the first thing that Stylo sees, and then there is the underscore. So it knows that this is the part I take and I put it in the color. So answering your question, if you don't have any underscore, but just one name, you will get all of the text just in black, because it won't know how to distinguish, like what are your expected differences here. And of course, you don't have to want colors, but why are colors useful here? Because now we have a fairly nice recognition. We can see that the texts by particular authors are located on the same branches or very close to one another. But we can also see that there are some that sometimes one text is a bit further and so on. And if the classification happening here wouldn't work well, then we would end up with different texts in different colors positioned on different branches. And it's much easier to see that there is something off when we suddenly have a bit of blue here where we expect just brownish and green, than just reading everything. So colors will help you to, especially with slightly bigger corpus, to see where there is some misclassification happening and so on. But before we go into this, let's run Stylo again. Now you know how to do this. And when you run Stylo, you should get the graphical user interface. And we will still explain a little bit about what's going on here before we rest. Once you run Stylo and you have the graphical user interface, I already mentioned there are 5 different
excuse me, Joanna, sorry.
the problem is now I lost it. Okay.
We should just restart our.
What?
It has sometimes happens. This is if you see the TCK weird words objects, it happens. No.
Is it enough to do that? Or...
Just let me quickly do that.
See, this is why I don't use RStudio. Never happens when you just use the console R, but I will not force you to do this. I know it's nice to have everything in one place.
Yeah, so.
Yeah. Okay, so now that you have the window, hopefully on your own screen, and you can see there are 5 different categories of things. Don't click OK yet, because as you know, clicking OK will run the experiment immediately. But I will just briefly explain what's going on in particular parts of this graphical user interface. So first we have input and language. And when it comes to input, there is this distinction between plain text file, so just TXT, XML files, and HTML files. And as said, we generally recommend that you stick to TXT. XML and HTML should work, and they will work, but if there are any errors in the formatting of XML or HTML, parts of the code will be recognized as parts of the text rather than as the code. The second thing that you can choose from is language. And language here is somewhat important in the sense that to make things faster, Stylo can load different UTF-8 setting. UTF-8 is a way of encoding characters in a language on the computer so that the computer can the computer doesn't need words to be written in letters as we do, but it actually always converts them into chunks of numbers. If any of you ever heard of binary code and so on, this is what's happening underneath the hood, right? We don't want to look there, but we want the computer to read it properly. So UTF-8 is the best way to convert your text, because then all of the special characters will be preserved. So if you're using languages that have diacritics, if you're using languages that are written from right to left, that are not written in Latin characters and so on, you want to have the text saved in UTF-8, and you want to select the other category. There is here different versions of English, including the English with contractions or English without contractions. There are different spellings of Latin, which might also be useful if you're examining Latin. You might know that sometimes U and V are spelled in a different way, so it's good to have this fixed. And you don't have to convert the whole all of the text, but just use it like this. The particular languages that are named here are just that somebody who was working on them and had some requests, and then there was some specific requirements made for these languages. But if you use other, you will be fine no matter what language you are using. So I usually just select other, whatever text I'm using. And just to make sure, CJ key is Chinese, Japanese, Korean. If your texts are not in UTF-8, you can also choose to select native encoding, but be aware that then there might be some problems with reading them. So, for example, if your texts are not in classic Latin characters, using classic Latin characters, and the texts are saved in ANSI, which is one of the older formats for encoding language, then you might have some problems, for example, with word delimitation or character delimitation or recognizing them. Then we have the next section, features, and this is where the more important and interesting things happen to us. So here we can select whether we are using words or whether we are using characters, and whether we want to examine just one as a feature or whether we want to have more. Usually it makes no sense to examine characters when you have n-gram 1, unless you want to count how many times a particular character is used in your corpus. But I can see why this can be interesting, but it's probably not useful for your research. But if you're using, for example, as you mentioned, you're working with Turkish, or if you're working with Hebrew, for example, you might want to try using characters and n-gram size 2 or 3. There is also a way to preserve the case, because by default Stylo will bring everything to lowercase. So the uppercase doesn't matter in general, but in particular cases it might be super important for you, so you can choose to have it like this. Then you have the most frequent words settings, and the default is that we examine just 100 most frequent words, but actually the recommendations are that you can use a longer vector. For inflected languages, it usually makes sense to have a slightly longer vector. Like there were studies that for German, for example, it's good to use around 1,000 words for reliable analysis. But again, we would recommend that you try different options and you see how stable your results are. If you select here, let's say 1,000, what will happen is that Stylo will produce 10 different analyses, because we have the increment, so the increase happening by 100 words. So the first analysis will be 100 most frequent words, then it will be 200 most frequent words, 300 most frequent words, all the way to 1,000. And this can also be very useful, because if you're not sure what number of features will be best for your data set, by running this series of experiments, you can see where is the point where the results get stable. If it's that you always get the same classifications, that the same texts always sit together, or whether your data set is actually quite chaotic and the texts are grouped together randomly and different in each of the runs. So this will also tell you something about your data set. Then there is also option of culling, and culling is removing the words that don't appear in all of the text. And you can set a certain percentage here. For example, if you set culling to 20%, so just put the minimum and maximum value of 20, then a word needs to appear at least in the 20% of the text in your corpus for it to be considered a feature that will be examined. So this is one way to remove proper names. If you think about analyzing, for example, fantasy books, you will have a lot of proper names, and you're not necessarily interested in seeing the word Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and so on very high on your most common words list, because this will only be characteristic for one book series. But you might be very interested in seeing how the word magic or the word cat or broomstick or wand appear, where they appear on this list. So by setting some sort of some level of culling, you're not deleting those words from the text themselves, but you're just omitting them in creating the list of most frequent words. And this is something that that is also commonly used. Usually the values of culling that will be useful will be between 10 and 50%, but of course it depends on how many novels you have in your corpus. As an experiment, you can try later just to set the culling to 100% and see how very few words are in common for all of the novels in your collection. This value is usually quite low. There is also the option to delete pronouns. This is not necessary, but you can choose to do so. And also, if your machine is slightly slower, or if you have a very big data set and the computations take a long time, you can choose to use existing frequencies or existing word lists, or both, once you've done your first analysis. So then the process of creating frequencies for the whole corpus is the most time consuming part of the analysis. So if you select it, it will quicken your study. You can also select your files manually or upload a list of files. If you click it and then click OK, it will give you the folder path to select from. We're running out of time, right?
Like everybody's hungry.
Okay.
Hungry for some lunch.
And my style of rose. So let's stay at it for now. So yeah, it's beautifully frozen. See, this is what happens when you have a slow machine and you're not cleaning it properly. So feel free to play around now during the lunch after you've eaten and so on. If you want to